So we're talking about chapter 20 from the aspect of your lymphatic vessels. Their job is to pick up fluid that gets leaked and hangs around in your tissues. Remember, we call that interstitial fluid. Once your lymphatic vessels pick it up, we call it lymph or lymphatic fluid, okay? And this is gonna get dumped back into your bloodstream. And so we left off talking about some of the organs that we find in the lymphatic system. So we walked through our lymph nodes. So now we're gonna walk through some of these organs. One of the organs that I want to walk you through is the spleen. This is the biggest lymphoid organ. I always remember the stomach and the spleen, the two S's, they sit right next to each other in the abdominopelvic cavity. Remember when we look at arteries and veins, remember we have that splenic artery that branches off of that celiac trunk that goes to the spleen. And the functions of the spleen, it has a lot of different functions. It is where lymphocytes proliferate. Okay, so we can proliferate our lymphocytes. It's also a great place for immune surveillance. So if lymphocytes hang around in the spleen, this is a great place for them to look for foreign organisms or foreign antigens that don't belong. Also remember, I called your spleen the red blood cell graveyard back in chapter 17, because it truly takes out those aged, dying red blood cells from circulation. There are a lot of macrophages in the spleen that help to remove debris. And again, if your spleen is going to be the red blood cell graveyard and it's going to take red blood cells out of circulation, it's also going to store a lot of the breakdown products from those red blood cells, including things like iron that can be used later. It also is going to store things like platelets and monocytes. Remember, that's a type of white blood cell. And they think that it's a site of red blood cell production in a fetus. Okay, so now we know that all of our formed elements are red blood cells. They all come from red bone marrow. But in a developing fetus, before that red bone marrow is really pumping out those formed elements, something else has to do it. So they think that the spleen is one of the sites of red blood cell production in a fetus. So this is an image of the spleen. It kind of has that really dark color to it. So I'll have a lot of students who'll be like, is this part of the liver? When they look at it in the rat, just because it has that sort of texture and color that the liver has. That dark color is because of all of the blood. So when you look at an organ, if it's really dark in color, like the spleen and the liver, you know that they're dark in color because they contain a huge amount of blood. Now there's two areas to the spleen. There's the white pulp. The white pulp contains mostly lymphocytes, white blood cells. And so the big function is immune function. And then there's the red pulp. The red pulp is red in color because it has a lot of red blood cells and macrophages. And so if you look at this image, you can really tell the white pulp. I'll circle the label over here, and you can see that area that's a little lighter in color. And then around it is this red pulp where it's darker in color. Okay. Now the spleen has a really thin wall around it. And so it is very easy to rupture. A blow to the side of the torso can cause the thin-walled spleen to rupture. An infection, any kind of swelling in the spleen can cause it to rupture. But your spleen has this amazing ability to repair itself. Now, it used to be that if the spleen was ruptured, they would remove it. So in the early days, boxers, for example, a lot of boxers, as they've aged, they don't have a spleen anymore because it got ruptured through fighting. And they would remove the spleen because if it's removed, the liver and the bone marrow basically take over all the functions of the spleen. But now we know we don't really have to do that, right? We can leave the spleen in place because it is able to regenerate very quickly. And so in children, even if there's a little tiny piece of the spleen that is left in the body, it will regenerate itself. Now, a couple of other lymphoid organs I'll mention are some lymphoid organs that we call MALT or mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. And these are basically tissues in the mucous membrane. Mucous membranes are moist membranes that we have throughout the body. And if you have lymphoid tissue within that membrane, it means that it's going to be great at protecting you from foreign antigens. So where do we find this lymphoid tissue? We find it in the tonsils, we find it in the intestines in areas called Pyres Patches. We find it in the appendix. We also find it in the respiratory, urogenital organs, and the digestive tract. So pretty much lining any open cavity in the body, you'll have MALT. So we'll start with the tonsils. These are the simplest lymphoid organs. They basically surround your pharynx, so the opening of the digestive tract. And you have sort of 4 different kinds of tonsils. Palatine tonsils. These are at the back of the oral cavity. These are the ones that are most often infected. So I'll circle them here. These are the ones, if you still have your tonsils, they're the ones that are kind of those big balls in the back of your throat. When they're infected, they get bigger. Little kids sometimes can have what's called kissing tonsils. And it's when those palatine tonsils are so big, they're touching. Lingual tonsils. These are grouped at the base of the tongue. So I'm going to circle it back here. If you look in the mirror at your tongue, you open your mouth and you stick your tongue out. The way back of your tongue, there are these big bumps way in the back. That's tonsil. That's the lingual tonsil. So it's basically at the base of your tongue. The pharyngeal tonsils, we also call these the adenoids. You've probably heard of those. These are in the back of the nasopharynx. And then tubal tonsils, they sit right next to those adenoids. And tubal tonsils will surround the openings of the auditory tubes or the Eustachian tubes. These are, we also call it the pharyngotympanic tube. It's all the same name, okay? These are those tubes that are in the middle ear that drain the middle ear into the back of your throat. So this is also why if you get strep throat or any kind of throat infection, it is very quick to spread up those pharyngotympanic tubes into your ear. And this is why little kids, a lot of times, if they start with a sore throat, they end up with ear infections, okay? And they'll get the pus behind the ears. Problem is, if you get that infection up in that pharyngotympanic tube, if the tubal tonsils and the adenoids swell, which they do when you get an infection, they can cover the opening of the pharyngotympanic tube and it won't be able to drain. And that's truly when a child has an ear infection. There's a lot of pressure behind the eardrum, it hurts. They used to treat ear infections by rupturing the eardrums. They actually used to take a probe, stick it in your ear and just pop the eardrum open so that the pus could come out. We don't do that anymore. That can cause lots of hearing loss if it's repeated over time. Now, and we'll talk about this later, but now if kids get repeated ear infections, they'll put tubes in the ears. And tubes are basically just little teeny tiny little tubes that they stick in the eardrum and it holds the eardrum open. It's an opening and it allows the pus to drain out. Okay. A lot of times when kids have tubes put in their ears, they may also have their adenoids and tubal tonsils removed at the same time. That's just going to allow everything to drain and stay open. Problem is with ear infections especially is that repeat ear infections can also cause hearing loss, can cause little ossicles, the bones in the ear to fuse together. And if those fuse together, you can't transmit sound back to the cochlea, which we talked about in Anatomy 1. All of these tonsils, their whole job is to gather and remove pathogens that you are either eating or breathing. Okay, so it makes sense in terms of their location. They surround your pharynx, which carries air and food. So in this picture, the picture on the right, so we can see these palatine tonsils. You can see those are infected. I think someone asked me last week about pus pockets. Those are pus pockets on the back of the tonsils, okay? You can see in this image right here, the top left, you can see this is the opening for the pharyngeal tympanic tube. It's letting things drain out of the ear. And then you can see the adenoids right there. So if you get an infection in the throat and it can spread up that pharyngeal tympanic tube to the ear, and if that adenoid enlarges, it can cover over the opening. Again, that can lead to those ear infections. This is another image down here in the bottom left. This is showing adenoids that are incredibly swollen. And when adenoids get really swollen, you can kind of look at the top image. If this adenoid swells up really big, it's actually going to cut off that nasal cavity. So little kids with really big adenoids, a lot of times, not only do they get ear infections all the time, but they also snore a lot. So I remember when my son was really little, every time we went to the pediatrician for like, you know, his monthly checkups, and then it became yearly checkups, they always asked, does he snore? They want to know if they snore, because if they're snoring, they know there's a problem with the adenoids, but also they're not getting oxygen to the brain, and that can impair brain development, especially in little kids. And so that might be a reason to see an ENT, and they may end up taking those out. Now remember, your tonsils have follicles with germinal centers. Remember, this is where the B cells are found. We have a lot of B cells in there. And there are also these tonsillar crypts, and this is where pathogens, foreign antigens, bacteria, sometimes even food particles can get trapped and stuck. And what it's doing is it's allowing your B cells to see this foreign thing and build immunity to it. Okay, so this is helping to build your immune system. And so I showed you this last week. You can see these crypts in here, these white spaces. Those are tonsillar crypts. So again, this would be any pathogen that you're breathing in or things that might be in your food that get stuck in those crypts. You can see these germinal centers, these circles here that contain all these B cells. Just gives them a chance to see these foreign things and get rid of them. Now, another molt that we have are something called Pyres Patches. We find these down in the intestines. These are clusters of lymphoid follicles. They're found in the distal portion of the small intestine. You also find structures very similar in the appendix. And the job of these, again, is the food that we eat is not sterile. We are not eating sterile food. Your food has bacteria on it. Our body just has a way to fight it off. Now, obviously, there are some bacteria that you eat that can cause you a lot of harm, like E. coli. You don't want to eat that, right? But you're not eating sterile food. Now, you put your food in the refrigerator to slow the bacterial growth down, but it doesn't stop it by any means. And so the whole point of having these in the small intestine is that they're able to destroy the bacteria on the food that you're consuming. They also prevent that bacteria from breaching the intestinal wall, getting out into your bloodstream. But they're also a place where you have these lymphocytes that are able to generate memory. We're going to talk a lot about memory in chapter 21 and what that means. That is basically your white blood cells' ability to recognize that something is foreign that's gotten in, and the next time that same thing gets in your body, it fights it off so fast, you don't even know you were sick. When you think of immunity, that's what you're thinking of. You're thinking of memory. So these are the molts that we find, right? So we have that, we've talked about the spleen, we've talked about Pyres Patches, the appendix, and tonsils. Now the last couple of things I'll walk you through in chapter 20 is just the development. So in terms of your lymphatic vessels, these are going to start to develop around the 5th week in an embryo. And they're basically going, the lymph sacs are going to arise from developing veins. And so usually this is why you're going to see lymphatic vessels and veins running very close to each other. All of your lymphatic organs are going to come from that embryonic tissue called mesoderm. Remember, mesoderm also gives rise to your connective tissues. And typically what we find is that lymphoid organs are not well developed at birth. as you build immunity, those lymphoid organs will get bigger and more developed. The exception to that is the spleen and the tonsils. Typically after birth, there are high numbers of lymphocytes, and their development will parallel the maturation of the immune system. So you're going to build the immunity. That child will build immunity as they are exposed to foreign organisms. Okay, so we'll talk more about this in chapter 21, but this also goes along with, you know, you don't want your child like crawling around on a dirty floor all the time, but it's okay if they put their hands in their mouth, and it's okay if they put something in their mouth, and that's all okay. Your kids can play in the dirt, because what we've seen study after study is that kids who do not go to daycare, only children who do not have older or younger siblings, children who don't play outside very often, those kids are much more prone to developing things like allergies and asthma than the kids who are in daycare and in school with other children, kids who play outside. They are healthier because they have built up their immune system. Okay. So in terms of the function of your lymphatic system, remember, it does a couple of things. In this chapter, what we really focused on is your lymphatic system in terms of maintaining blood volume. It takes the leaked fluid from your tissues and puts it back in your bloodstream. We touched a little bit on how there are some cells in your lymphatic system that will remove and destroy foreign organisms. And it really mobilizes your immune system. And so that's where we're headed in the next chapter. We're really going to focus on the lymphatic system in terms of immunity. Okay. Any questions that y'all can think of from chapter 20?